Itamar. We now move to the second presentation in our program. It will be delivered by Asher Sasser, who is a Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University. He was a director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies for 12 years and taught for over 35 years in the Department of Middle Eastern and African History. He has been a Fulbright Fellow, a visiting professor at Cornell University, the University of Chicago, Brandeis University, and the Stein Family Professor of Modern Israel Studies at the University of Arizona. The books he has published deal with broad developments in the Middle East, and in particular with the history of Jordan, of which he is a leading expert in this country. His presentation will deal with the fluctuations in the identities of minorities in the context of the tension between modernity and tradition, a subject which is one of the main fields of his current research. The title of his presentation is The Individual, Community and the State, Minorities in the Middle East. Bevakasha, Asher.
Thank you very much, Shimon, and again, Mazal Tov to Ofra for her latest book on the Kurds. The individual, the community, and the state. I will start with a discussion of the place of the individual in Middle Eastern society traditionally. And one should say at the outset that Middle Eastern society traditionally has not been one of individuals, but rather a society of groups. And the famous British historian Malcolm Yapp described Middle Eastern society in the 19th century as one composed of various groups, dealt with by the government in different ways. There was no assumption that society was composed of numbers of individuals who ought to be treated equally in a uniform fashion. Rather, different groups had different rights, and their status was established accordingly. More recently, Hazem Sargia, the very well-known Lebanese, London-based intellectual, speaks of the inherited social formations, be they religious, sectarian, tribal, or ethnic. They are overwhelming in the Arab Middle East, where there is very little room left for the individual. Though Sargia speaks mainly of Lebanon and the tendency of communities after the Lebanese conflict to retreat into their respective communities, the same could be said of Iraq or Syria or Yemen and so on and so forth. Sargia and others have written extensively on the critical importance in Arab politics of what Ibn Khaldun described in the 14th century of Asaviya, the ties of kinship and group solidarity, group identity based on religious denomination, sectarianism or confessionalism, as we have heard. The Ottoman Empire was based on this construction and systematically provided protection in its unequal format, albeit, for the various minorities and communities. Speaking about Western Europe, Benedict Anderson spoke of Western Europe in the 18th century. He remarked that nationalism in Western Europe was not only the dawn of the age, or the 18th century was not only the dawn of the age of nationalism, but the dusk of religious modes of thought. And in comparison to what Benedict Anderson said about Europe, I would like to say about the Middle East, that in the Middle East, the dawn of nationalism was never the dusk of religious modes of thought. And the two of them continued to coexist and to compete with relative measures of success in the marketplace of ideas. On nationalism, Bernard Lewis wrote many years ago that the introduction of the secular heresy of nationalism, of collective self-worship, is the best founded and the least mentioned of the many grievances of the Middle East against the West. So these European ideas like nationalism came into an area which was religiously and ethnically very, very heterogeneous. The European vocabulary of politics, as Elie Kaduri calls it, did not lead to very much progress, but rather to a great deal of destruction and conflict. Religious communities became ethnically mobilized in the name of nationalism. Ethnically mobilized national minorities, like the Armenians, for example, for whom it was no longer satisfactory to be a community of people, of believers in a religion and a language dispersed throughout the Ottoman Empire. They sought geographical autonomy. The obsession with territorial autonomy in the name of nationalism was an inherent threat to the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. And the result was genocide. Similarly, in other places, the destruction of communities in the name of nationalism, the Assyrians, alternatively, the Jews in Arab nationalist Iraq, who as minorities could no longer find their place in a state which offered no automatic protection, as the Ottoman system had done before. And the Kurds, if we are celebrating their political advancement, with the abolition of the Ottoman Empire, find themselves in a completely new situation. In the Ottoman Empire, the Kurds were part of the ruling elite. They were part of the ruling majority. By the way, the Kurds had a large part in the genocide of the Armenians on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. But in Turkey, Iraq, or Syria, the Kurds, after the Ottoman Empire, were suddenly shunted into the position of marginalized minorities in the Turkish state of which they were not a part as Kurds, and all of the Arab states of Syria and Iraq, of which they were not a part as Kurds. But for the most part, communities have survived and maintained their collective identity, albeit in the new circumstances in the modern age. Modernity has not moderated or reduced intercommunal conflict. It has actually exacerbated it. One might have thought, as many did, and I'll touch about that just now, that modernity would lead to the decline of religious, sectarian solidarity. But actually we witness quite the opposite, an exacerbation of sectarian and group conflict. Tradition has been more resilient than expected. That doesn't mean that tradition repeats itself. It doesn't. But the reinvention of tradition with the advent of modernization has led to what we could call neo-traditionalism. The emergence of tradition, albeit in very different formats. The interplay between modernity and tradition are not the dichotomous formula of early modernization theory. That is, modernization does not replace tradition. The two actually coexist. And modernization, or modernity and tradition, were actually artificial constructs as opposing each other. And the two of them actually coexist in a new formula whereby tradition invents and reinvents itself as part of the modernization process. So in contrast to the assumptions of early modernization theory and Marxist-inspired theories, tradition is often a profound vehicle for evolutionary and revolutionary change, as opposed to what might have been expected. Tradition can be employed to legitimize criticism of the status quo and to facilitate revolutionary as well as incremental changes. Iran is a good example, where tradition was mobilized in a new fashion in order to create a revolution. Tradition is a subtle and elastic concept, which is subject to reinvention time and again. So in the modern era, we have massive changes, like urbanization, mass education, modern communications and means of transport, rising industrialization and declining agriculture that revolutionize societies. But at the same time, the resilience of traditional values, as what I call this neo-traditionalism. The exposure to mass education actually provides members of the larger public with the educational wherewithal to invent and reinterpret tradition in the service of modern political ideas. So instead of eroding traditional parochial solidarities, modernization modernizes them and converts them into more effective instruments of group defense and promotion and combat for the rights of different communities. Politics and government become arenas of conflict between sectarian political movements that, according to modernization theories, shouldn't have existed at all, should have passed from the scene. There are four factors which have contributed to this resilience of tradition. First, religion and state. Religion and state have never quite ever been separate entities in the evolution of Middle Eastern history. Secondly, what we started with. Middle Eastern societies as societies of groups rather than societies of individuals. Thirdly, the Tanzimat. The reforms of the Tanzimat, particularly the legal reforms, that for the first time in the Ottoman Empire created a territorialization of the legal system. The same law applied to all. The advent of territorialization. With the spread of nationalism, we have the idea of sect linked to territory and territorial contiguity. From here, the distance to ethnic cleansing or even genocide is not too far. Fourthly, reform in the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere in Egypt too. Reform was generally top-down, not bottom-up. And the result is that societies over 2 centuries of reform haven't really been fully secularized. Far from it. Momentarily, it did appear as if Arab nationalism was superseding the minorities and sectarianism. But this was a superficial illusion. And there are many examples. Some have already been mentioned. The Ba'ath in Syria, ostensibly Arab nationalist, was a vehicle for the domination of the Alawi minority. The Ba'ath in Iraq, ostensibly Arab nationalist, was a vehicle for the supremacy of the Sunni minority. The National Pact in Lebanon, Algeria and Palestine, there are numerous examples of how religion remained very valid in what seemed to be, on the surface only, purely secular national movements. In Palestine, for example, we can say that Palestina Thawra of the PLO has given ground in recent decades largely to Palestine al-Muslima, Hamas and company. So Arab nationalism was a political failure. It was also never quite, as Professor Rabinovich has already mentioned, it was never quite the secularizing platform that it pretended to be. And if Arab nationalism failed politically, and the secularizing platform never quite performed its duty, it is not surprising that we see the return of Islamic politics. And the return of Islamic politics naturally means the replacing of the minorities in an acutely minority status. First of all, it means the division of the Arabs between Sunnis and Shias. And both radical Sunnah or radical Shia have their negative effect on the status of minorities. The Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Iran-Iraq War, all contributed to the rise of the Shia-Sunni confrontation. The advent of the so-called Shia Crescent, as King Abdullah of Jordan called it, the Saudi-led campaign to revive Sunni radicalism and opposition to the advances of the Shia. So this was not a return to the good old days of the Ottoman sectarian order, but rather sectarianism with a vengeance. And ISIS as an extreme example. As we've heard already, the Syrian uprising turned into a sectarian civil war. The communal genie was let out of its bottle, as Eyal Zisser has written. The Alawis fighting for their lives, as a majority of Sunnis turned against the Alawi-dominated regime. Ethnic cleansing of Sunnis in Alawi areas. And ethnic cleansing not only in Syria, but also in Iraq and Lebanon. During the Lebanese civil war, people who lived in mixed neighborhoods fled in fear to be with their own people. Today, Beirut is still divided into the mostly Muslim West and the mostly Christian East. Neighborhood sectarian displacement is the story of Baghdad after 2003. In Syria today, in the civil war, Syrian communities withdrawing into areas where they are numerically dominant. Assad today is said to be reshaping Syria's demographics. There are reports of Sunnis facing government obstacles to return to Syria. Sunni refugees not being allowed back into Syria in a deliberate effort to change the numerical balance between the Alawis and the Sunnis, encouraging Shias to come and live in Syria and to beef up the ranks of the Alawis against the Sunnis. Not to mention the fate of the Christians and the Yazidis in Iraq, and generally speaking, the emigration of Christians from the Middle East to elsewhere. This is true in Palestine. It's true in Iraq. It's true of the Copts in Egypt. It is a regional phenomenon. But with all the sectarianism and the exacerbation of sectarianism through modernization, as opposed to what one might have thought, the states did not break up. We have indeed the institutionalization and the entrenchment of the territorial state. But a weakening of the central authority in these authoritarian states. The states have not broken up, but central government has weakened considerably. There is a term in Arabic about the power of government, haybat al-hukm, the fear of government. The fear of government is no longer as fearful as it once was. And there is a much more proactive, activist defense of the group identity in these changing circumstances, in these weakening central governments. Communities escaping into their collective identity as a form of protection and safety against the risks and danger of modernity. So in an era of rising sectarianism, various Arab societies are engaged in what Nadav Safran, writing about Egypt half a century and more ago, spoke about the search for political community. But I think it would be more correct to say that this is more about the calculated and conflictual reconstruction of political community. And that we see in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in other places of our troubled region. Thank you.